From 1 Samuel 3, 1 through 10, from the New Revised Standard Version. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim, so he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel. And he said, Here I am, and ran to Eli, and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call, lie down again. So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call, my son, lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. And from John 1, 43 through 51, New Revised Standard Version. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, Follow me. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth. Nathanael said to him, Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip said to him, Come and see.
I hope as I begin sharing these thoughts with you today, and as I confess to this, that I'm not the only one who's ever done this. Has this ever happened to you that you get busy, you're hard at work, head down at your desk? Someone calls or comes by, stops in at the office and says, Isn't it just a beautiful day? Or they say, Did you see the sunset last thing today? And to be perfectly honest, I may sort of mutter something like, but I'm actually lying because I missed it. I missed the entire beautiful day. I missed the outstanding sunset because I was too busy and I was missing by being oblivious. I was missing the obvious. Today's scriptures, each in their own way, one from the Hebrew scriptures and one from the Gospel of John, they're giving us examples of missing what seems really obvious. In the reading from 1 Samuel that Karen read first, we heard that the word of the Lord was rare, visions were not widespread. It's like they're trying to ask us to forgive Eli and Samuel for being as dense as they were, for not understanding what was happening around them. You would think, since they were both serving in the temple of the Lord, ministering to the Lord is what the text says, that they would sort of be attuned to the voice of the Lord. But then the text does say people were not familiar with the Lord in spite of it. It still seems to me like in the temple, they were missing the obvious. But I appreciate this story, and I appreciate the hymn we sang at the beginning of worship this morning. Here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? It's all about hearing the call of God. And it turns out it's not a simple matter. It turns out that listening for God's voice is not as obvious as it seems at first. Because if we take our cues from the story in Samuel, sometimes we're literally asleep. Sometimes we're young and easily confused. And even if we're not young in age, we might be young in understanding. Now, Samuel had the issue of being both young and without understanding of the Lord. Sometimes we are not listening because we are distracted. And clearly, as this passage from 1 Samuel shows us, we need that call over and over and over again. And that before we even have an understanding of who's talking to us, who's calling out to us. I invite all of you to go find a minister friend that you know, anybody, any minister you know, and ask them sometime to tell you their call story. You'd be surprised at the kinds of stories you hear. If you think it's a simple matter of, well, I believe the Lord called me to ministry, and so I went to school, and here I am, you have another think coming. I invite you to go find a friend who's a minister and ask them to tell you their story. they're usually pretty funny stories. Surprising. I know this because I'm in a clergy support group where we are sharing our call stories, and not a one of us heard God's voice at first. Not a one of us. There's another way that we can miss God's voice in our ear, God's voice in our life. And that was made clear through the brief passage that Karen read in the Gospel of John, when Philip finds Nathanael and tells him, "We have found the one about whom the prophets and Moses have written and spoken. He is Jesus, the son of Joseph, from the town of Nazareth." And Nathanael, who's full of prejudice against that backwater town of Nazareth and those backward people of Nazareth, said, "Oh, for pity's sake, can anything good come out of a town like that?" And Philip simply says, "Come and see." Philip is wise, because Philip knows that the only way to truly break down a prejudice, a stereotype against another, the only way to do that is to be in relationship. You have to meet that person, speak with that person, engage with them. Be open to seeing their humanity. Be open to seeing the divine spark in their lives, the glow of God in their life. Nathanael is convinced after meeting Jesus. Samuel is convinced with the help of his mentor, Eli. You know, Eli had 3 sons. They were supposedly all raised up to follow in their father's footsteps, be priests and prophets like their father. And it turns out they all came to a bad end. You can read that story sometime. And it was the outsider, the kid named Samuel, who actually became the prophet to King David, the mighty King David. We're pretty clear from the gospel stories that Jesus spoke with hundreds and hundreds of people. But the ones we remember by name are just 12. And the women who are listed as following Jesus as well, they are very few, called by name and remembered as those who heard Jesus and followed him. I think there's a warning for us then in this story, in both these stories. We're being challenged to not be oblivious to the voice of God, the messenger of grace, the insistent voice of wisdom that calls and calls and calls. But we often don't listen. When I was a teenager, full of teenage insecurities and teenage drama in high school, I went on a weekend retreat. And I was advised as part of that prayer time and retreat time to look for 5 good things in every day. And then later in the event, to find 5 good things in myself. I had to look and I had to listen really hard, because teenagers, they look at themselves and they say, there's nothing right about me. And they look at their lives and they weep and they wail and they say, there's nothing bad in my life. It's hard work. Practice might make it easier. I'm, in my 60s now, and I have days where I can actually do that. And there are days where I still fail to do that. But the challenge is to be aware and to be grateful. And these are not just exercises. These are this awareness, this gratitude, this is part of the entryway into communion and communication with the Holy One, to hearing the voice of God calling you. And I do believe that as God calls us, our lives are expanded. We are more courageous. We find purpose. We find joy. We find big love and big mercy, big compassion, and big possibility. And I'm not talking, when you listen to the voice of God, I'm not talking that you're all going to become ministers or chaplains. I know those are considered callings, but the call of God, if you will, is to be awake, to be aware, to be grateful in your life, no matter what you do. And that is a life filled with God, a life filled with gratitude and awareness of God in your life. And even if it's in the middle of the night, like the child Samuel, you realize the voice speaking to you is the voice of love. And all you need to say is, speak. I'm listening. I am listening. Well, listening is hard work. It's hard when our prejudices and our biases block our ears, like they did to Nathaniel. And it's hard to listen in the dark when you're afraid and you're not clear who it is who is speaking to you, like Samuel, when he thought it was Eli, and it was not. Right now, in our nation, there is a lot of talking, even shouting, not a lot of listening. It's a dark time right now. And we have to listen carefully in the dark for the right voice, the voice of God in our national darkness. Right now, there's prejudice and bigotry and people living without the gratitude and awareness of grace. People who don't look and see that divine spark shining out of someone else's eyes. And this darkness has led us down a dark, ruinous, violent, destructive path. And it is not the path that God calls us to. We need justice and accountability and truth-telling and responsibility. And we need those first. But like Nathaniel, we also need to let go of our prejudices and work on building a relationship. Like Samuel, we have to discern the voice of God amongst all the voices. And it is not God's voice. Of this I am certain. When the voices in the nations spew lies and calls to violence and calls for destruction, it is not the voice of Jesus. When it is the voice crying out for the death of others, for in cursing and hating and shaming others? Tomorrow is our national celebration of the life of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he is very famous in our land for his work and his prophetic words. Here are a few. This one is often spoken, and I wonder if we're truly listening, when he said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can." Right now in America, this may seem like a really tall order. This is our dark time. But love that drives out hate does not condone evil. Love doesn't mean you even necessarily have to like them. Love is bigger than like. It does mean that we have to do the hard work of being aware and grateful and aware of the value of the life of every other. It means we cannot write each other out of our lives, and we are not called to despise others without knowing them, without taking the time. We have to listen to one another, and we must not wish them ill, even on those who wish us ill. We are called to act with good intent on the behalf of others and stay awake to their suffering and their confusion and their fear. And yes, stay awake to our own places where we are blinded because we are afraid or we are suffering and we are scared and we are confused. We have to agree, like Samuel, like Nathaniel, to listen. Listen hard. Let go of our prejudices. Samuel lay in the dark, confused, but listening. We are in the dark too. This is the time of national darkness. But amid the voices howling in this national night of darkness, we are called to listen for the voice of God, the voice of Jesus. And that is the voice that we are called to follow. In that voice, the voice of Jesus, the voice of God, in that voice, we find our purpose, our life, and our hope, even in the darkness. It is our job to follow the voice of God. May we find the courage to do so. Amen.